Every Saturday at precisely 7 in the morning, a strange and deafening chorus rises across the suburban landscape. It is not a call to prayer or a civil defense siren, but rather the collective roar of thousands of small internal combustion engines. This is the opening hymn of suburbia's most dedicated cult, where millions of otherwise rational humans willingly sacrifice their weekend sleep. They do this to participate in a highly coordinated, weekly ritual of cosmetic execution. Armed with rotating steel blades spinning at 3,000 revolutions per minute, these suburban warriors march in neat, parallel lines. Their sworn enemy is not a dangerous predator, but a highly specific non-native species of monocotyledonous plant known simply as turf grass. To maintain this green deity, the average homeowner will invest thousands of dollars into a specialized mechanical chariot. This machine exists for the sole, paradoxical purpose of cutting down the very thing we pay to grow. We purchase expensive chemical nutrients to force the grass to grow faster, only so we can spend our limited free time cutting it back down. It is a perfect closed-loop system of self-inflicted labor. The supreme commandment of this cult is absolute uniformity. Every single blade of grass must be kept at a precise, government-approved height of exactly 2 inches. If a single rogue blade dares to reach 2.5 inches, it has committed a heresy against the neighborhood aesthetic. To prevent such moral decay, we dump millions of gallons of fresh, drinkable water onto our lawns every single day. In fact, turf grass is the single largest irrigated crop in the United States, easily eclipsing actual food like corn or wheat. But unlike corn, you cannot eat your lawn, unless you happen to be a particularly depressed goat. To protect this inedible investment, we wage relentless chemical warfare against any other plant that attempts to coexist with it. The humble dandelion, a harmless yellow flower that bees actually love, is treated like an invasive biological weapon. We spray toxic herbicides to ensure our green carpet remains a sterile, ecological desert. This biological purity is not for our own enjoyment, as we rarely actually sit on the grass we labor so hard to preserve. Instead, the entire operation is a theatrical performance staged for the people living directly across the street. We spend our weekends sweating and cursing in the sun to appease neighbors we actively avoid eye contact with at the mailbox. The lawn is a silent green billboard, broadcasting our compliance with the collective social contract. To let your lawn grow wild is to declare yourself an anarchist, a social pariah who has abandoned the basic tenets of civilization. And if you refuse to conform, the local high priesthood, otherwise known as the Homeowners Association, will swiftly intervene. They will issue passive-aggressive letters and financial penalties, all because your plants dared to behave like plants. We have trapped ourselves in a bizarre, self-funded cycle of green servitude, but to understand why we willingly participate in this weekly madness, we must look backward in time, because this entire modern obsession began not with suburban pride, but with a group of ridiculously wealthy French aristocrats who wanted to brag about how useless their land was. Welcome to 17th century France, where the ultimate flex wasn't a gold carriage, but a massive patch of absolutely barren dirt that you deliberately chose not to farm. At the time, almost every square inch of European soil was desperately needed to grow wheat, cabbage, and livestock feed just to keep the population from starving. But if you were a high-ranking nobleman, actually using your soil to produce food was considered incredibly tacky and middle class. Real wealth meant having the financial freedom to look at a highly fertile valley and say, let's put absolutely nothing there. This grand philosophical statement of uselessness manifested as the tapis vert, which translates to green carpet. It was a perfectly manicured flat stretch of turf grass that did not produce a single calorie of food. By keeping this land completely barren of crops, you were silently screaming to your neighbors that you were so wealthy you didn't need agricultural yield to survive. It was the 17th century equivalent of buying a sports car just to park it in a driveway and set it on fire. Of course, maintaining a giant green carpet in an era before motorized lawnmowers was an absolute logistical nightmare. To keep the weeds away and the grass short, aristocrats had to hire literal armies of low-wage peasants. These laborers would spend their entire days manually hacking at individual blades of grass with hand scythes. It was backbreaking, highly inefficient work designed entirely to make sure a rich man's view remained uncluttered by actual productivity. Imagine starving to death while your daily job is to make sure the grass doesn't accidentally grow anything edible. Naturally, this absurd French fashion trend quickly crossed the English Channel to the estates of the British nobility. The British, blessed with a naturally damp and miserable climate, realized their island was practically built for growing useless, soggy turf. They took the concept of the lawn and scaled it up to ridiculous, sprawling proportions. English landscape architects began tearing down actual working farms and productive orchards, just to replace them with sweeping vistas of empty green. Because nothing says, I own this country, quite like turning a perfectly good orchard into a giant empty green void. The lawn became a physical boundary line separating the ultra-wealthy from the dirty, working-class masses. If you walked up to an estate and saw a massive, manicured lawn, you knew instantly that you were in the presence of someone who didn't have to work for a living. The common people, meanwhile, packed their tiny yards with practical things like vegetables, chickens, and medicinal herbs. To the aristocracy, a yard that actually kept you alive was the ultimate sign of poverty. To manage these massive estates without paying hundreds of peasants, the English rich hit upon a clever shortcut: sheep. Livestock were allowed to graze on the lawns, acting as natural, self-replicating lawnmowers that kept the grass short. However, this introduced a major aesthetic crisis because sheep have a terrible habit of leaving green, mushy landmines everywhere they walk. To solve this, architects invented the ha-ha, a sunken fence that kept the animals away from the house without ruining the continuous view of the lawn. It was called a ha-ha because that is the exact sound the rich made when they realized they could hide their poor sheep from sight. As the centuries rolled on, the standards for what constituted a perfect lawn became increasingly pathological. Any plant that wasn't a specific type of turfgrass was branded as an invasive enemy that had to be ruthlessly eradicated. Clover, which naturally fertilizes the soil and keeps lawns healthy, was cast out as a low-class weed. We literally decided that a healthy, self-sustaining ecosystem was too ugly to look at. For a long time, this madness remained a luxury exclusive to the top 1% who could afford the massive labor costs. But then came the Industrial Revolution, bringing with it a wave of new wealth and a desire among the rising middle class to mimic the nobility. Suddenly, every factory owner and merchant wanted their own miniature version of Versailles in their front yard. Since they didn't own thousands of acres, they simply shrunk the tapis down to fit their modest suburban plots. It was the birth of the suburban lawn, a tiny bite-sized slice of aristocratic arrogance scaled down for the average man. This democratic expansion of the lawn was finally made possible in 1830 when a man named Edwin Budding invented the mechanical lawnmower. Now, instead of hiring an army of peasants or a flock of sheep, a single suburban father could manually shave his yard in an afternoon. The lawnmower turned a feudal status symbol into a weekend chore, convincing millions of working people that they were living like kings. And so, we willingly chained ourselves to a weekly ritual of manual labor, all to maintain a tiny green monument to a French king who died centuries ago. To understand how this useless green rug became a psychological hostage situation, we must turn to the late 19th century sociologist Thorstein Veblen. Veblen coined the term conspicuous consumption to describe the delightful human habit of buying incredibly useless things just to prove we have money to burn. In Veblen's eyes, the lawn was the ultimate flex because it was a piece of highly fertile land dedicated entirely to producing absolutely nothing. If you grow cabbages on your front yard, you are signaling that you actually need to eat to survive, which is incredibly embarrassing for your social standing. But if you grow acres of non-native turf grass that requires constant watering, chemical poisoning, and manicuring, you are announcing that you are rich enough to waste resources on a massive scale. The suburban lawn is essentially a physical manifestation of a bank statement, printed in chlorophyll and displayed to the public. Over the decades, the middle class eagerly adopted this aristocratic flex, transforming a symbol of idle wealth into a mandatory chore for the working man. We somehow convinced ourselves that spending our precious Saturdays sweating behind a roaring motor was a sign of civilizational progress. This is where conspicuous consumption morphs into a bizarre form of self-inflicted class warfare, where we act as both the feudal lord and the peasant. We demand perfection from our soil, policing every rogue dandelion as if it were a peasant revolt threatening our mini-kingdom. Gradually, this aesthetic preference hardened into an unyielding moral code that governed suburban life. Today, a tall patch of grass is not just a biological reality. It is viewed as a profound moral failure on the part of the homeowner. Neighbors will peer through their blinds, muttering about your lack of civic pride, as if a wild lawn is a gateway drug to complete societal collapse. Homeowners associations have formalized this paranoia, weaponizing fines and legal threats against anyone who dares to let nature do what nature does. We have created a system where the highest civic virtue is keeping a plant perpetually decapitated at exactly 2.5 inches. This brings us to the existential dread of the chore itself, which bears a striking resemblance to ancient Greek mythology. Albert Camus famously used the myth of Sisyphus to describe the absurdity of human existence, condemned to push a boulder up a hill only to watch it roll back down. Sisyphus, however, had it easy compared to the modern suburban homeowner. The boulder, at least, remained the same size, whereas your lawn is actively plotting its comeback the moment you turn off your engine. Every Saturday morning, millions of people pull a cord to ignite a noisy, gas-guzzling machine of destruction. We then spend hours walking in precise, mind-numbing geometric patterns, pushing a spinning blade over thousands of tiny green necks. The air fills with the smell of freshly cut grass, which is actually the chemical distress signal of a plant screaming in agony. We find this scent pleasant because we have successfully associated the trauma of nature with the satisfaction of a job well done. But the moment you finish, the clock starts ticking again. Photosynthesis, that relentless engine of solar-powered growth, immediately begins repairing the damage you just inflicted. Within 24 hours, the tips of the grass have already begun to regenerate, mockery in botanical form. By next Friday, the green carpet is once again unruly, demanding that you pay the weekly tribute of your labor. It is a perfect closed loop of useless energy expenditure. We burn fossil fuels to power a machine that cuts a plant, which only grows because of the water and fertilizer we paid money to dump on it. We are essentially paying to participate in our own hostage crisis, funding both the captor and the rescue mission. Camus argued that we must imagine Sisyphus happy, finding meaning in the struggle itself. But it is hard to imagine the suburbanite happy when they are nursing a sunburn and breathing in two-stroke engine exhaust. The modern lawnmower is a Sisyphean boulder with a pull start, a device designed to consume your free time under the guise of home ownership. We have internalized this endless loop so thoroughly that we feel guilty when we do not participate in it. To sit on your porch and watch the grass grow without a sudden urge to cut it down is to commit a quiet act of suburban treason. We have traded the actual wild biodiversity of the earth for a sterile, monoculture desert that we must personally police. In doing so, we spend our lives fighting a war against biology, a war that we are biologically guaranteed to lose. The grass does not care about your property values, your neighborhood reputation, or your weekend plans. It only knows how to grow, and it will keep growing long after you have pushed your final lawnmower across the yard. Yet, we continue the march week after week, pushing our noisy blades in circles, chasing an aristocratic dream that died in the French Revolution. But the French aristocrats are gone, replaced by a far more terrifying force, your local homeowners association. What began as a collective agreement to keep neighborhoods tidy has morphed into a decentralized network of suburban fiefdoms. These modern fiefdoms are governed not by royal decree, but by 300-page bylaws bound in cheap plastic. And at the absolute center of this bureaucratic empire lies the holy grail of suburban conformity, the Kentucky bluegrass. To maintain this aesthetic purity, HOAs have deputized retirees armed with clipboards and a profound lack of hobbies. They patrol the asphalt borders, scanning for the ultimate act of treason, a grass blade measuring 3.1 inches instead of 3. Should your lawn dare to express its natural biological desire to grow, the machinery of administrative punishment begins to grind. First comes a polite warning printed on paper that smells faintly of passive-aggressive disappointment. Then come the daily fines, accumulating faster than the weeds they are designed to suppress. And finally, the ultimate escalation, the threat of foreclosing on your entire home because of a stray yellow dandelion. It is a beautiful system where you can lose your actual physical shelter because you failed to groom your useless decorative weeds. But the HOAs are merely the foot soldiers in a much larger, highly profitable war known as the turf industrial complex. This is a multi-billion-dollar empire built entirely on the premise that nature is doing it wrong. To keep this artificial ecosystem on life support, we must feed it a constant diet of synthetic chemicals. We buy nitrogen to make it grow faster, only to immediately buy expensive machines to cut it back down. It is the perfect business model, selling both the accelerator and the brake to a consumer who is paying for the privilege of driving in circles. Then come the selective herbicides, engineered to murder any plant that has the audacity to not look like a cloned green wire. In this chemical warfare, biodiversity is the enemy, and a sterile green monoculture is the only acceptable surrender. To ensure this surrender, we dump over 80 million pounds of pesticides onto US lawns every single year. That is 10 times more pesticide per acre than we use on the actual crops we eat. Because while poisoning our food is a regrettable necessity of mass agriculture, poisoning our front yards is a matter of pride. And when the rain inevitably washes these chemicals away, they travel straight into our local waterways. We have successfully traded thriving aquatic ecosystems for the aesthetic of a golf course in a desert. Speaking of deserts, the turf industrial complex requires an amount of water that borders on hydrological comedy. In the United States, suburban lawns consume nearly 9 billion gallons of water every single day. That is enough drinking water to sustain the entire population of Canada for several months, dumped onto dirt to keep a non-native plant from turning brown. In places like Arizona and Nevada, we are actively draining ancient aquifers to simulate the climate of medieval Normandy. It is a spectacular display of human hubris fighting the laws of thermodynamics with a plastic sprinkler from a hardware store. And if the water runs dry, the HOA will still fine you for having a brown lawn, creating a beautiful catch-22 of bureaucratic doom. You can either break the municipal water laws or break the HOA bylaws. Either way, a man in a polo shirt is coming for your money. This institutional lock-in is reinforced by a deep psychological terror of what the neighbors might think. To have a messy lawn is to signal to the tribe that you have given up on civilization itself. It suggests you might also be harboring wild animals, or worse, non-conforming thoughts about municipal zoning. So we conform, spending our precious weekends pushing 60-pound spinning blades over the same patch of dirt we mowed 7 days ago. We burn fossil fuels to power the mowers, to cut the grass, which releases carbon, which warms the planet, which makes us need to water the grass more. It is a self-sustaining feedback loop of ecological stupidity, maintained entirely by social anxiety. We have turned our outdoor spaces into sterile, green carpets that support absolutely zero local life. No bees, no butterflies, no native flowers, just a flat, silent monument to our obsession with control. We have successfully conquered nature, and in doing so, we have built our own highly manicured prison, a prison where the warden is your neighbor, the sentence is life, and the only escape is a weekly 2-hour chore. To perform this weekly penance, we march behind a roaring, gas-powered blade of conformity. But just when we think we have tamed the green wild, the ultimate suburban supervillain emerges from the soil. The dandelion is a masterpiece of evolutionary design disguised as an existential crisis. We despise this plant simply because it dares to be yellow when our feudal ancestors demanded green. The dandelion has absolutely no respect for your local homeowners association bylaws. It possesses a taproot deep enough to survive a minor nuclear event, while our fragile turfgrass faints at the mere suggestion of a dry breeze. To combat this yellow menace, we spend billions of dollars on highly sophisticated chemical warfare. We coat our yards in toxic cocktails designed to keep our green carpets perfectly sterile and dead to the rest of the ecosystem. Consider the neighborhood dad, patrolling his property line like a low-budget action hero protecting a sacred border. He is defending a monoculture that provides absolutely zero ecological value to any living creature. Because in the suburban mind, a single yellow dot on the emerald canvas represents a complete and total collapse of social order. It whispers to the neighbors that you have given up on life, or worse, that you actually tolerate biodiversity. But the dandelion is a persistent rebel, deploying wind-powered paratroopers to colonize the entire neighborhood. A single seed head holds 100 tiny compliance violations just waiting for a gust of wind. When a child innocently blows on a dandelion clock, they are actually committing acts of biological warfare against property values. Perhaps the real absurdity is our refusal to accept defeat against a plant that has been winning this war for 30 million years. We could easily eat them, considering every single part of the dandelion is edible and packed with vitamins. Instead, we buy imported lettuce wrapped in 3 layers of plastic while spraying poison on the free salad in our front yard. It is a brilliant triumph of marketing over basic human survival instincts. So, what would happen if we simply decided to stop fighting this ridiculous war? The grass would grow tall, the clover would return, and your property value would supposedly plummet into the dark abyss. Because modern civilization is apparently held together entirely by a 3-inch turf height restriction. The ultimate rebellion against our medieval masters is not a grand political statement, but a rusty lawnmower left to rot in the garage. Let those yellow flowers bloom like tiny, defiant suns across your useless green canvas. Watch your neighbor twitch behind his blinds as his manicured empire is threatened by a single, unbothered weed. We can finally laugh at the absolute futility of our weekend battles against the natural world, for in the end, the concrete will crack, our suburban subdivisions will fade, and the dandelions will still be here. So push your plastic mower into the sunset, pour a cup of dandelion tea, and enjoy the beautiful, chaotic mess of a real yard.